Keanu Reeves' face changed. Jimmy Fallon's smile disappeared. No one in the studio was breathing. It happened so fast that the cameras almost missed it. 1 second, America's most beloved talk show host was mid-laugh, leaning back in his chair with that signature Jimmy Fallon energy that has defined late-night television for over a decade. The next second, complete silence. The kind of silence that doesn't belong on a comedy show. The kind that makes your heart stop. Keanu Reeves was holding a photograph. Just a simple, worn photograph that someone from the audience had passed to a producer during the commercial break. But the moment Keanu's eyes landed on that image, everything stopped. His hands started trembling. His jaw tightened. And Jimmy Fallon, the man who has interviewed everyone from presidents to pop stars, the man who always knows what to say, froze. Because what happened next would become the most powerful moment in Tonight Show history. A moment that had nothing to do with comedy, and everything to do with being human. But to understand why this photograph shattered two of Hollywood's most composed men, we need to go back to the beginning of that night. Back to when everything seemed normal. Back to when no one in that studio had any idea they were about to witness something that would change them forever. It was a Tuesday night in New York City. The Tonight Show studio was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. Audience members were settling into their seats, the Roots were warming up, and Jimmy Fallon was doing what he always does, going over his note cards, cracking jokes with his crew, making sure every single person in that building felt welcome. Keanu Reeves was scheduled as the main guest. It was supposed to be a standard promotional appearance, nothing unusual. He had a new film coming out, and Jimmy had prepared his typical mix of playful questions and genuine curiosity. The two men had known each other for years, shared mutual respect, but tonight's interview was supposed to be light, fun, forgettable in the best way. The show started exactly as planned. Jimmy delivered his monologue with perfect timing, the audience laughed in all the right places, and when he announced Keanu Reeves, the crowd erupted. Keanu walked out with that humble smile, that slight awkwardness that somehow makes him more endearing, and sat down across from Jimmy. For the first 12 minutes, everything was perfect. They talked about motorcycles, about Keanu's love for the crew members on his films, about that time he took the subway and no one recognized him. Jimmy was in his element, Keanu was relaxed, and the audience was eating it up. Then came the commercial break. During those 4 minutes when the cameras stopped rolling, something happened backstage that no one was prepared for. A producer approached the stage manager with an unusual request. An audience member, an elderly woman sitting in the third row, had asked if it was possible to give Keanu something. Not an autograph request. Not a gift. Just a photograph. The stage manager hesitated. This wasn't protocol. You don't interrupt a live show for audience requests. But something in the producer's voice made him pause. She says it's important, the producer whispered. She says Keanu will understand. Jimmy's head producer made a split-second decision that would define the rest of that night. Give me the photo. I'll look at it first. What she saw in that photograph made her hands shake. And she knew immediately that this wasn't just a fan wanting attention. This was something else entirely. She walked directly to Jimmy during the commercial break, leaning in close so the audience couldn't hear. There's a woman in the audience with a photograph. I think you need to let Keanu see it. I think this is bigger than the show. Jimmy Fallon looked at his producer. They had worked together for nearly 10 years. He trusted her completely. If she was saying this, it mattered. Okay, he said quietly. We'll handle it. The cameras came back on. Jimmy smiled at the audience, made a joke about the commercial, and turned back to Keanu. But something had shifted in his energy. The Roots noticed it. Questlove would later say that he saw Jimmy's shoulders tense, saw him take a deeper breath than usual. So, Keanu, Jimmy started, his voice steady but different. Before we continue, there's someone in our audience tonight who has something they'd like to share with you. If that's okay? Keanu's expression changed slightly. Confusion, maybe curiosity, but also that openness that defines him. "Of course," he said simply. Jimmy gestured to the audience, and the elderly woman stood up. She was probably in her late 70s, wearing a simple blue cardigan, her hands clutching a small envelope. The camera found her, and you could see she was trembling. "Ma'am, would you like to come down here?" Jimmy asked gently. She nodded but didn't move. One of the staff members helped her down the stairs, and the entire studio watched in complete silence as she made her way to the stage. Jimmy stood up. Keanu stood up. The informality of it, the breaking of the show's rhythm, made everyone lean forward. The woman reached the desk, and for a moment she just looked at Keanu. Her eyes were filled with tears, but also something else. Gratitude. Recognition. Love. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but picked up perfectly by the microphone. "You don't know me. But I know you. And I need to show you something." She handed him the envelope. Keanu took it with both hands, treating it like it was made of glass. He looked at Jimmy, who nodded encouragingly, and then he opened it. And that's when everything stopped. Inside the envelope was a single photograph, old and faded, the edges worn from being held too many times. It showed a hospital room. A young boy, maybe 9 years old, bald from chemotherapy, was sitting up in a hospital bed. And sitting next to him, with his arm around the boy's shoulders, was a younger Keanu Reeves. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Keanu stared at the photograph. His hands started shaking. His breathing changed. Jimmy watched his guest's face transform from curiosity to recognition to something deeper, something that looked like it hurt. "That's my grandson," the woman said softly. "That picture was taken 17 years ago. You were filming The Matrix Reloaded in our city, and you heard about a children's hospital nearby. You didn't have to visit. There were no cameras, no press. You just showed up. The audience was completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop in that studio. You spent 2 hours with him." She continued, her voice breaking now. "You talked to him about motorcycles. About being brave. You made him laugh when he hadn't laughed in weeks. You signed his cast. You promised him you'd come back." Keanu was still staring at the photograph, and now everyone could see the tears forming in his eyes. "He passed away 3 weeks after that photo was taken," the woman said. "But those 2 hours you gave him were the happiest I'd seen him in months. You gave my family a moment of light in the darkest time of our lives." Jimmy Fallon stood frozen behind his desk. This was no longer a talk show. This was a moment of raw, unfiltered human connection happening in front of millions of people. Keanu finally looked up from the photograph, directly at the woman, and the expression on his face was something the cameras could barely capture. It was grief and gratitude and something ancient and human. "I remember him," Keanu said, and his voice cracked. "I remember his laugh. He told me he wanted to be a stuntman when he grew up." The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "He never stopped talking about you. He made us promise to tell you, if we ever got the chance, that those 2 hours meant everything. Behind the scenes, every producer, every camera operator, every member of the Roots had stopped what they were doing. Some were crying openly. This wasn't television anymore. This was life. Jimmy Fallon did something he had never done in his entire career. He took off his tie. Not for a bit, not for a joke, but as a gesture of respect, of informality, of acknowledging that what was happening transcended the show. He walked around his desk and stood next to Keanu. "Ma'am," Jimmy said softly, "would you like to sit down? Join us?" A staff member brought out a chair, and the elderly woman sat between Jimmy and Keanu. The three of them sat there for a moment, not speaking, just existing in that space of shared humanity. Then Keanu did something that no one expected. He took the photograph and held it up to the camera. "This is why we tell stories," he said quietly. "Not for fame. Not for money. But for moments like this. For connection. For remembering that we're all just trying to be kind to each other. Jimmy nodded, his own eyes wet now. What was his name? He asked the woman gently. Michael, she said. His name was Michael. Michael, Keanu repeated, looking at the photograph again. I wish I could have come back. I wish I could have kept that promise. You did keep it, the woman said firmly. You're here now. And Michael would have loved that you remembered him. The studio audience, which had been silent for nearly 5 minutes, an eternity in television time, suddenly stood up. Not because someone told them to. Not because applause signs flashed. They stood because they needed to. They stood because they had just witnessed something real in a world that feels increasingly fake. The applause wasn't loud or celebratory. It was quiet, reverent, the kind of applause that says, "We see you, we honor this, we understand." Questlove, sitting behind his drums, started a slow, soft beat. Just a heartbeat rhythm. The rest of the roots joined in, creating something that felt more like a ceremony than a musical cue. Jimmy looked at Keanu, and Keanu looked back, and something passed between them that didn't need words. An understanding that they had both just been changed by this moment. Thank you for coming tonight, Keanu said to the woman, taking her hand. Thank you for trusting me with this memory. Thank you for raising someone who brought light into the world, even if it was too brief. The woman smiled through her tears. Thank you for seeing him. For treating him like he mattered. He did matter, Keanu said firmly. He does matter. Always. Jimmy helped the woman stand, and as she walked back to her seat, the entire audience remained standing, still applauding softly. The moment stretched on, and no one wanted it to end because everyone knew that when it did, they'd have to return to normal life. And normal life suddenly felt very small compared to what they'd just witnessed. When the woman finally sat down, Jimmy didn't return to his desk. He stayed standing, his tie still off, his note cards forgotten somewhere behind him. I don't know what to say, Jimmy admitted to the camera, his voice honest in a way that felt different from his usual hosting style. I've done this show for years. I've interviewed hundreds of people. But I've never experienced anything like what just happened. Keanu stood next to him, still holding the photograph carefully. Some moments are bigger than entertainment, he said simply. This is one of them. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The interview never resumed. There was no point. Anything else they could have talked about would have felt trivial. Instead, Jimmy made another unprecedented decision. He invited the entire audience to stay after the show ended, to share stories, to connect. And they did. For 2 hours after the cameras officially stopped rolling, people stayed in that studio. Audience members shared stories about their own moments of unexpected kindness. Crew members who had worked in television for decades admitted they'd never seen anything like it. The Roots played quiet, gentle music while people talked and cried and laughed, and remembered that beneath all the noise of modern life, we're all just looking for connection. Keanu stayed the entire time. He didn't have to. His handlers had a car waiting. He had dinner plans. But he stayed. He listened to every single person who wanted to share their story. He took photographs with anyone who asked. And he kept Michael's photograph in his jacket pocket. Later that night, after everyone had finally left, Jimmy sat alone in his office. His producer found him staring at nothing in particular. You okay? She asked. Jimmy nodded slowly. I keep thinking about all the times I've chased laughs. All the bits and sketches and games. And they're great, they matter, people need to laugh. But tonight was different, she finished. Tonight reminded me why any of this matters, Jimmy said. It's not about the jokes. It's about the moments when we stop performing and start being real with each other. The next day, every major news outlet covered what happened on The Tonight Show. But they didn't call it an interview. They called it a moment. A reminder. A gift. The video clip went viral, but not in the usual way. People didn't share it for entertainment. They shared it because it made them cry, made them think, made them want to be better. Comments flooded in from people sharing their own stories of small kindnesses that had changed their lives. The hashtag Remember Michael trended worldwide. Keanu Reeves never gave another interview about that night. When asked, he simply said, "Some things are sacred." But people close to him noticed a change. He started visiting more children's hospitals, always without cameras, always without publicity. He established a quiet foundation in Michael's name. And Jimmy Fallon kept that tie. He never wore it again. Instead, he framed it in his office with a small plaque underneath that simply reads, "The night we stopped performing and started being human." Because sometimes, the most powerful moment on television is when television stops being television and becomes life. When two men remember that beneath the fame, the cameras, and the applause, we're all just trying to honor the people who touched us. We're all just trying to be kind. Michael's photograph still sits in Keanu's jacket pocket. A reminder that the smallest acts of kindness can echo for decades. That 2 hours spent with a dying child matters more than 1,000 red carpets. And somewhere, a grandmother sleeps better knowing her grandson's memory lives on. Not just in her heart, but in the heart of a man who refused to forget. In a moment that reminded millions of people why compassion will always matter more than celebrity. That's the legacy of that night. Not a viral clip. Not a trending topic. But a reminder that we all have the power to be someone's light in their darkest moment. We just have to choose to show up.